This morning's panel is going to be sort of the first part of organizing and talking about cyberspace operations. Now it is of necessity somewhat U.S. focused. I apologize in advance for that. It's easier to reach out and get speakers. And sometimes, in many respects, cybercom, since its inception, has been the big target. And one of the things that this panel is going to discuss is how cybercom came to be, the idea, the predecessor organization, JFCCNW, which is Joint Force Component Command Network Warfare, underneath the United States Strategic Command. And our first speaker, Mr. Ron Reed, who is currently in the General Counsel's office at Microsoft, was the Chairman's legal counsel in the 2005 to 2008 timeframe, during which the Joint Force Component Command Network Warfare was established underneath U.S. Stratcom. And one of the things he's going to speak to is the strategic impetus behind establishing that command. Mr. Reed will also be in a position to provide some industry perspective that I think, as we discussed last night, he's the only speaker here from industry. And it's going to be significant to hear Mr. Reed's comments, particularly on some of the aspects of civilian objects and military objectives with respect to how the industry views the stand-up of Cyber Command, the impetus, the renewed visibility of cyberspace operations in the military domain, as we like to use it, and how that impacts the commercial industry. So at that point, Ron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Again, thank you for having me here today. I need to let you all know that I'm here in my individual capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of Microsoft, so for the folks in the press, you know, this is Ron Reed. This isn't Microsoft necessarily making comments or statements. But I have, as Paul pointed out, kind of a dual perspective on this. And during my time as the senior counsel to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I supported General Pete Pace. And during that time, obviously, there were some issues that Paul's asked me to talk about related to the stand-up of JFCCNW. But then I also have a little bit of perspective over the last 4 years at Microsoft in terms of how we view cyber, how we view the domain, and how we view the impact that cyber operations can have on industry as a whole. So to start, my thoughts related to the organization and how ultimately Cyber Command came to be in existence. If you think back to and about the time that you were talking about your first cyber conference in 1998, that was actually the year that they stood up JTF CND. And one of the things that I've noticed throughout the course of the cyber development is the fact that generally these organizations are developed after disasters, right, after something bad happens. Not that the conference was a disaster. I don't think that had anything to do with the stand-up of JTF, Computer Network Defense, but it followed a time when there was a recognition that this was real, and we needed to take real action and have organizational constructs related to the threat that existed. Quickly understood that, you know, computer network defense, while important, isn't sufficient, and it changed to computer network operations to take a broader focus and a broader perspective. And that happened very shortly after the JTF CND was stood up. And that continued in being for a period of time, and then the JTF global network operations got stood up after that. In the 2003 to 2005 timeframe, there were a number of incursions into DoD networks and other related networks of a very significant nature. And as I said before, it tended to be that as there were these very significant activities, there would be organizational changes and a recognition that maybe the way we're currently organized wasn't sufficient to deal with the threat or the problem. That, in many ways, led up to the creation of Joint Force Component Command Network Warfare. JTF GNO obviously had certain responsibilities at the time, but the thought was that, again, not sufficient to deal with the threat and not sufficient to have the active type of defense that might be required as cyber was developing. Remember, throughout this entire time, the concepts and the actual operation in the cyber domain were changing, constantly changing, and the use and uses of the cyber environment were changing. And so, at the end of the day, the stand-up of Joint Force Component Command network warfare really was driven by a lot of those, for lack of a better word, disasters or significant incursions into networks. Finally, when you have Joint Force Component Command network warfare, you've got Joint Task Force Global Network Operations operating side by side. You're creating gaps and seams. You're creating potential problems or areas where something's not being covered properly. And so the thought was to bring those together and create United States Cyber Command. My old boss, General Pace, a few days ago in a talk I think he gave at the Heritage Foundation, said that the current organization with General Alexander having the Title 10 authorities under U.S. Cyber Command, the Title 50 authorities under National Security Agency, that maybe it was time to think about giving him a third hat and having the responsibilities currently under the Department of Homeland Security under Title 6. I know that later on in the week you're going to talk about a Title 10, Title 50, add Title 6 to the mix because, again, to the extent that there are gaps and seams in the cyber defense arena between agencies or organizations, that's when you can see problems. And again, you don't want a disaster necessarily to drive the next organizational change. And I know that obviously a lot of controversial aspects if General Alexander were to take over a defensive homeland security, the critical infrastructure protection in the United States. But again, that's been proposed. Let me change focus a little bit and talk just for a minute or two about industry perspective. As I said, this is my perspective, not necessarily Microsoft's, but I've been there for about 4 years. And I think I understand where at least Microsoft is coming from. And generally speaking, there's some commonality amongst the other relative folks in the industry. First, I think everyone does agree that as a entity, cyber is a domain. You all have defined it as a military domain, but in fact it has common shared characteristics. I read one article that described it as akin to the commons. While it's got no geographic boundaries, it's very much like the maritime commons or the space commons, and the need for access to it, transit through it, the use of it is critically important. And I think there's a general acceptance and appreciation on the part of industry that that's in fact a true statement. Obviously the industry focus is how can you make money on that, right? I mean, to the extent that there's a market out there, and I think the last numbers that I've seen for the cybersecurity market range in the $16 to $20 billion range currently per year. My guess is that's only going to increase. But again, to the extent that it's a defined domain, I think there's general agreement on the part of industry that in fact is true. So then what is the impact for military operations in that domain as it might affect industry? There is certainly going to be, and I had some conversations both last night and this morning about the advent of the cloud. And I'm sure you've all heard about cloud-based computing environments. The days of an individual network inside a building supporting one entity or organization may be behind us, not totally, but to a certain degree. There are obviously scale and savings that both governments and other consumers want to realize, and by sharing those resources in a cloud environment, you can do that. So what does that mean from an operational perspective? Well, when you target a cloud, you're not just targeting necessarily the entity that you want to affect, but you may be targeting other unrelated commercial interests, other government interests, non-military interests. And so that's something that's going to certainly complicate. To the extent that 85 to 90% of the cyber domain is owned privately, the infrastructure and other aspects of it, certainly as you do your military planning, you're going to have to take that into consideration. To the extent that we're thinking about military operations here today, another troubling aspect in the cyber realm is the fact that industry, at least certain companies within the industry, are starting to take matters into their own hands. There's some discussion about offensive operations by industry. That that would concern me, and I think it would concern all of you. One of the issues, and I think Paul's going to want to talk about later, is attribution, and how do you identify who and what is affecting you or your network. To the extent that the ball field all of a sudden is now more crowded with state actors, non-state actors, industry players, et cetera, that's going to affect your calculus and how you need to view and how you need to think about cyber and operating in the cyber world. And then lastly, with respect to, okay, what ought to be the legal regimes or legal regulations that cover or affect the cyber realm, from a business perspective, obviously, we want regulation that enhances business, enhances the ability of consumers to use and trust the cyber domain. With respect to reporting requirements, obviously, right after the 9/11 incident and the cooperation between companies like Verizon and the U.S. government, that resulted in significant liability exposure. Ultimately, it was fixed by legislation, but I think in the cyber area, be thinking about that before we get into that kind of situation is probably going to be something that is important to do. So with that, I think, Paul, I'm going to leave it to the questions. I know that we wanted to spend most of the time on this in the questions, but I wanted to provide that just as a background.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. Our second speaker is uniquely situated to speak about the topic which he was assigned in terms of building U.S. Cyber Command. Captain T.J. White is a 1987 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. A close reading of the biographies will indicate that I'm a big fan of Captain White's graduation year. I think it's one of the best classes to ever come out of the United States Naval Academy, and I'm in no way biased in any way, shape, or form by the fact that I'm one of his classmates. Captain White had a very interesting career serving on the USS Missouri battleship. Has been is now in his second tour as a commanding officer in the Navy cryptologic community, standing up the Naval Security Group activity in Bahrain as his first tour, and now he recently took command of the Navy Information Operations Command Maryland, NIOC Maryland, which is the force provider of the Navy cryptologic forces for the National Security Agency. Prior to assuming command of NIOC Maryland, Captain White served for a considerable period of time in the predecessor organization to Cyber Command, Joint Force Component Command, Network Warfare, as well as becoming a plank owner when Cyber Command stood up. He served as the director of the Commander's Action Group with daily, one may say near immediate access, and I don't mean immediate for Captain White, I mean immediate access for General Alexander to reach out and grab him by the scruff of the neck and say, I need this, this, and this. Please give me a paper on this and a study on that, and heard these J-code cats and dogs together and prepare these kinds of strategic documents. So Captain White is very, very excellently placed to discuss the growth of Cyber Command, how and why we transitioned away from JFCC&W and became the sub-unified command, United States Cyber Command, under the Strategic Command. He also has devoted a considerable amount of time to thinking about why and whether or not Cyber Command should become a combatant command. So I'm sure that he will be well positioned to answer any questions you may have on that score as well. Captain White?
Thanks, shipmate, I think. So I prepared my remarks here on my iPad, which I brought, and it's locked up outside, so I had to default to the paper and ink version, so I apologize. I'm a little discombobulated. I'm in the process of getting my eyeglass prescription updated, so I'm going to be doing a lot of this. So age is a pain. If I could just set the stage for my reference, by a show of hands, how many engineers are in the room? 2, 4, 6 out of 160. How many operators are in the room? 6. How many lawyers are in the room? We will no doubt get a lot done. Okay, so at the end of the day, in thinking about the stand-up of U.S. Cyber Command, my observation, having reported to JFC CNW in the summer of 2008 is that these things often, in the context of the Department of Defense, are a result of a couple of driving factors. In this case, it was a combination of external actors and some unfortunate internal structural deficiencies on the part of the department. If I could ask you to go back to October 2008, in terms of time and space, we were confronted as an operating force forward, engaged in active theaters of operation in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and a couple other places around the globe. And as we were thinking about doing those operations, we were confronted with the potential compromise of our data security. We became very suspicious in the integrity of the content upon which we were making decisions, and we had certainly lost confidence in some of those command and control capacities. So for the operators in the room, I would imagine that their recollection of that circumstance as a description equals all bad. And that was a driving factor in terms of what now do we do. Secretary Lynn, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Lynn, has written a pretty extensive article on that event published in the Foreign Affairs magazine. I would encourage all of you to quickly consult that. But for those at JTF-GNO and JFC-CNW, separated in time and space by about 28 miles down the BW Parkway and around the Beltway, this is what we would technically call an oh shit moment. Not good. Very concerning in terms of the services, the goods, and the confidence that we were supposed to provide for the department, the joint forces, and coalition partners. So quite simply, something had to be done. And that is what the Department of Defense is good at, mobilizing around an imperative. So I think that we embarked initially on an effort to mobilize leadership. That didn't require a lot of work inside the department. It required, my recollection, some information briefs, some clarification of some terms, frequent consultation with the lawyers, and I think that we were mostly there pretty quickly. We also had to recognize and accept the problem, and I think that is perhaps the most substantial ongoing effort. My observation, those in the senior levels of government, whether the department executive branch or other branches, frankly get it. If anyone was to be characterized as part of the problem in this space, I would say it was officers serving at or near my pay grade. I think the sailors that I work with daily, 18, 19, 22, 25 years old, they clearly get it. They are natives in this space and they understand the environment that they grew up in. My peers and I struggle what this means on a day in and day out basis. And I think the last thing that we had to do was match needs to solutions. And this is right now an optimization process. We are currently, or previously, we were organized as two components under U.S. Strategic Command, JTF-GNO, JFC-CNW. They came together in the fall of 2009 as a consequence of that October 2008 effort. That resulted in the nomination and confirmation of a commander for U.S. Cyber Command, organized as a sub-unified command under U.S. Strategic Command. Discussions are ongoing about what the future might hold for the department. But doing all of that to date is something that the DoD is good at. We excel at things that require leadership. We have mature processes, we have structured methods, and we apply them rigorously. We do very well in the planning and execution. So we were confident that we could do this. And I think the simple fact that a conference today is hosted by U.S. Cyber Command and the Naval War College is indicative of the fact that the department got that part of it right and continues on a journey with the rest of government to figure out how to do it better. And then much of the dialogue, I suspect, over the next couple days will be about the public-private partnerships and what the appropriate and necessary interactions with the private sector ought to be. But the mission in the context of a Department of Defense and a component of that department is really about how do we contribute to defending the nation and how do we support the nation's national security interests around and across the globe as determined by the President. And in the planning of that, we orient on capability and capacity, and we do that irrespective of the domain that we're talking about. So air, land, sea, space, or cyber, it's immaterial. We bring all of our thinking, much of it honed in organizations and institutions such as this, to that fight, to that problem, to make sense of it. In cyberspace, like the other domains and dimensions of warfare, you have to be able to see it, you have to be able to understand what you're seeing, make sense of it, and you have to be prepared for it. You need to think about operational maneuver. You need to think about how do you get to and achieve a certain degree of readiness. You need to think about what your mission posture and profile is going to be, both internally looking and externally focused. You need to think about the implementation or activation of countermeasures and how you will eventually take action. But equally important, which I think one of the things that U.S. Cyber Command is chartered to do, principally, is understand and build and shape a workforce currently and in the future. So as we go back or went back to that October 2008 period, if I was to offer an assessment which drove our desire to stand up, I recently heard, as we look at the them in this space, there's a lot of sinners and there's a lot of sins being committed daily, constantly. States, non-state actors, criminal and other enterprises around the globe, their demonstrated capability is getting better. That's not changing. It's probably accelerating. And in view of the latter, the sins part, I would say that whether it's exploitation for a knowledge advantage or disruption for a competitive advantage or possible destruction for market advantage, they are collectively growing. From a U.S. standpoint, we had remained up to this point largely static in this space, and that needed to change. Our calculus in thinking about this was pretty straightforward. We were growing ever more interconnected. As a consequence of that interconnectedness, we had achieved, not just as a department, but probably as a nation, in more ways than we were comfortable thinking about, a degree of dependency, whether it was public or private infrastructure. And as a consequence of that dependency, we have now exist in an environment with a high degree of vulnerability. And when it comes to risk management from a DoD standpoint, that's commonly thought of as a function of threat, capability, and consequence. And we are on the losing side of very hard math across all of those variables. So the answer in short, the imperative to stand up a U.S. Cyber Command was about taking those that are expert in conducting network operations, those that are expert at defending those networks, and thinking about conducting maneuver operations from a defensive standpoint, and those that are thinking about conducting offensive operations together under a single coherent leadership that would have the ability to mobilize and adhere capacity and capability. And that is what I think the fighting premise, the preparedness premise is for U.S. Cyber Command. And again, that's really about leadership. And I think that that authority under that commander provides a degree of coherency as a single commander, and that is necessary to meet the speed of the decision required in this space. And I think that organization, which is now more aligned than it had been in the past, and generally across functional and horizontal components, which is necessary to make the speed of maneuver to be successful in this space. So when thinking about the law aspects, from the international standpoint, I would say that from my view, thinking about operations in this space remains a little unsettled. That's what all of you will contribute to. And there are known regimes that we adhere to and comply with. In this space, we understand those. We know what those lines are, and we don't cross them. From a domestic standpoint, that stand-up was very well guided by the department's known processes and structures. We knew that we had to do interaction with Congress. We knew that was going to be guided by the National Security Staff and the President and the timings and tempo and how we would set that up. The congressional oversight is there. The compliance standard from the judiciary is very, very high. So from a U.S. Cybercom standpoint, I'm not there anymore, so I can't speak for them. But at the time, we had a lot of care-abouts, but we only have one mission in this space. And we work very hard to be better than competent. So I'm getting the hook from my partner. And Eric, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Captain White. A very excellent presentation. Our third speaker can take and build upon that and extend it one step further, because one of the things that's critical about how Cyber Command was stood up is the fact that General Alexander, as the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, is also dual-hatted as the director of the National Security Agency. So he holds two of the very major responsibilities in this area, in this arena. And Eric has been asked to speak about the intersection of intelligence and military operations. And Eric is very well placed to have that discussion and to initiate the conversation, hopefully, that we can have with you in the question and answer period on those points. He has served as a counsel at the Central Intelligence Agency, at the Federal Bureau of Intelligence, and served prior to coming to Cyber Command as the chief counsel for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. When Eric was hired at Cyber Command as the director of, or the policy advisor for the director of operations, he was uniquely placed to put that interagency experience to work. Due to an internal realignment, he now has the title of Deputy Director of Operations for Future Operations, which involves thinking about how we're going to be operating in the future, thinking strategically, and bringing his interagency perspective, his intelligence community perspective to bear on thinking those big, deep thoughts. Eric?
Thanks, Paul. And I want to first say thank you for the organizers of the conference for holding this. This, to me, what this represents is not only an opportunity for me to, sit up here and espouse my ideas, but also an opportunity to exchange ideas with all of you and for you exchange ideas with one another. To me, that's one of the more critical functions, something that you can't really accomplish by paper or over phone as easily. So I really do see the value of holding symposia and conferences like this, and I'm honored to play a role in it. Let me also say that noting the presence of the Cybercom Chief of Staff in the audience, to the extent any of the remarks I offer are in disagreement with her own, they are my personal comments only. So what I wanted to do in the short time I have available is actually make an argument. And it's one that I will be presenting in fairly stark and simplistic terms, so forgive me for that, but I'm happy to, through Q&A period, go into a little bit more detail or after the session if people are interested in talking about it. But the basic idea, I'll encapsulate it in one sentence, is that for cyber operations that fall below the level of use of force, in international law, they will end up or should end up being regulated in the same way that espionage is. And that is neither expressly permitted nor expressly prohibited. But let me set that argument up a little bit by first drawing a distinction between the way that cyber operations are treated under U.S. domestic law and international law. We're still in the process of sorting out how to deal with cyber operations from a point of view of both domestic law and policy. And I think the easiest way I can illustrate this is by noting that you can look at law related to intelligence activities, law related to Title X military operations, and law related to covert action. And there is overlap, but also distinction between and among those various categories. And it's not always perfectly clear where cyber operations fall, because they bear, even when conducted as a Title X military operation, they still bear some similarity to both intelligence operations and, in certain instances, covert action. For those who aren't familiar, the definition of covert action under U.S. law is an action where the involvement of the U.S. government is not to be acknowledged, that is an effort to influence political, military, economic conditions in another country. It's a broad definition, but an important note is that there are two explicit carve-outs, three, but two that are relevant. One is for any activity that is primary purpose intelligence, not a covert action. So those are mutually exclusive categories. Same thing with traditional military activities, where unfortunately traditional military activities is not well defined, at least not in statute, or even to a greater extent defined, but still not well in the legislative history associated with the covert action statute. In that lone statute, you have those three concepts that are side by side with categories that are meant to be exclusive of one another, but where it's not entirely clear how you draw those lines. And cyber operations, I think, make it very difficult. It is very difficult to try to categorize cyber operations in only one or another of those categories. And so, as I say, this is a process that is still ongoing within the U.S. government of how we're actually going to treat these operations. Now, under international law, let's divide cyber operations into two categories. ones that rise to the level of use of force and ones that fall below. For ones that rise above the level of use of force, and here again, I'm simplifying this argument, so some may take issue with it, but I believe that first, let me take a step back and say, there's a question of, okay, how do you define when a cyber operation actually rises to the level of use of force or ones that fall below? And what I'll say quickly about that is that you have the same question in the kinetic realm, that we have definitions for use of force that apply to kinetic operations, but they are not precise. And there is, I think, a prevailing attitude of, I know it when I see it, for defining a use of force in the kinetic realm. And I think the same is true in cyber. It's a little bit more complicated. I think there's a little bit more gray space, partly due to the fact that we just don't have as much experience with dealing with cyber operations, but also because in the kinetic realm, things tend to go boom or not. In cyber operations, there is the prospect of making things go boom, but that many cyber operations are designed to avoid actually having things explode. So because of the many and various ways in which you can conduct non-explosive cyber operations, it raises some level of confusion about when you actually cross the line. But I don't think it's dramatically more complicated than trying to find that line in the kinetic realm. So two categories, above and below. For those that actually do rise to the level of use of force, cyber operations that do rise to the level of use of force, I believe that those are going to be regulated by the same principles of jus ad bello and jus in bellum that kinetic operations are regulated under. Again, simplistic argument, but I think that you can actually draw that broad distinction. For ones that fall below the use of force, I think that you're going to see a great deal of difficulty doing anything other than regulating in the same way that espionage is. Now, we do see underway right now some bilateral and multilateral efforts to reach agreements on regulation of cyberspace operations. The Chinese and the Russians have both been more aggressive than I thought they would be in trying to establish these agreements. But I would submit that I don't put much hope in the prospect that we're actually going to reach meaningful accords in regulating cyberspace operations. And I would say, what would you think of an effort to try to regulate espionage activity on a multilateral or bilateral basis, except as between very close allies, for example, among the Five Eyes, where there has been some success. But among adversaries or potential adversaries, I don't think you're ever going to reach agreement on regulation of espionage activities for the simple reason that while nobody really wants to be spied upon, everybody wants to reserve the right to spy on other people. And I think you can say the exact same thing about cyber operations. Nobody wants cyber operations conducted against their interests on their soil, but they're not prepared to forego the opportunity to do that to others. And so I believe that you're going to see cyber operations entering into that same realm of international law effectively being silent on them. Again, and here I'm just limiting this to those cyber operations that fall below the level of use of force, where there is no explicit authorization for it, there is no explicit prohibition for it. And what I point you towards is the general notion that many cyber operations, when contemplated in the Title X context, can look very much like, if not identical to, operations contemplated in the intelligence realm. You might have a particular target, a router, for example, or a server, against which you want to conduct an intelligence operation because you want to be able to collect information from there, or you want to be able to avoid detection from doing that. You may have the exact same operation using the exact same personnel, the exact same infrastructure, going against the exact same target, but where your purpose is one that's generated from the Title X side of the house. And it's hard for me to imagine how you're going to say that from an international law perspective, there's a real distinction to be drawn between one operation and the other when they're the exact same function carried out by the exact same people with a different purpose. But let me be clear. I don't think that same principle applies when you're talking about the U.S. domestic law context, because in the domestic law context, your purpose matters. And I point you back to the covert action statute, where the way I think you navigate between and among those three categories of covert action, intelligence activities, and military operations is by the purpose. It's not the only way, but that is a principal navigatory tool for assessing which one of those categories you fall into. But under international law, that same distinction won't matter as much for two reasons. One is that most countries, or maybe many countries, simply do not make the same distinction between military authorities and intelligence authorities in the way that the United States does. In fact, in many cases, it's the same organizational entity that carries out both. The second is, I don't think that a country is going to react differently based upon the notion that their router or server that was just owned by their adversary was owned by an intelligence organization as opposed to owned by a military organization. Now, let me be clear that I've had this conversation many times with people in the United States State Department. They do not see it the same way. But to me, this is not something that is obvious or a no-brainer, but something that I think, in my view, is a reasonable position, and one that I believe is going to pan out as we see countries trying to negotiate through and apply new and different principles to cyber. I think in the end, you have the dichotomy that I referenced. Above the use of force, traditional rules of warfare apply. Below the use of force, it's going to be regulated like espionage. That's all I got.